think about the real world for a moment. A child inherits certain traits from their parents, maybe their eye color, their height, or their smile. They do not have to develop these traits from scratch. The same idea applies in Java. When one class inherits from another, it automatically gets all the non-private fields and methods of the parent class without rewriting them. This is one of the most powerful features of object-oriented programming because it promotes code reuse and reduces repetition. Let us look at the three types one by one. Single inheritance is the simplest form. One child class inherits from exactly one parent class. One parent, one child. For example, the class dog extends the class animal. Dog now has access to everything animal defined like a method called eat or a field called name without writing those again inside dog. Multilevel inheritance is like a chain. Animal is at the top. Dog inherits from animal. Then puppy inherits from dog. So puppy has access to everything in dog and everything in animal. It is like a grandchild inheriting traits through both the parent and the grandparent in a chain going level by level. Hierarchical inheritance is when one parent class is inherited by multiple child classes independently. Animal is the parent. Dog, cat, and bird are all separate child classes that each extend animal. They all share the same parent but are completely independent of each other. A dog is not directly related to a cat, they are just siblings under the same parent. One very important rule, Java does not support multiple inheritance with classes. This means one class cannot extend to classes at the same time. Java made this decision deliberately to avoid confusion and errors. However, Java does provide a way to achieve this through interfaces, which we will cover later in this video. Let us walk through this code step by step. We have three classes here: animal, dog, and puppy. Each one builds on top of the previous one, forming a chain. This is exactly what multilevel inheritance looks like in real Java code. Starting from the top. The animal class is the root of our chain. It has a field called name which holds the value animal, and a method called eat which simply prints eating to the console. Animal does not extend anything, so it sits at the very top of our hierarchy. Next we have the dog class. Dog extends animal. This one line, extends animal, is what makes dog a child of animal. By doing this, dog automatically inherits the name field and the eat method from animal. Dog does not need to rewrite them. On top of that, dog adds its own new method called bark which prints barking to the console. So dog now has three things: the name field, the eat method from animal, and its own bark method. Now comes puppy. Puppy extends dog. So puppy is a child of dog, and dog is a child of animal. This makes puppy the grandchild in this chain. Puppy adds its own method called weep which prints weeping to the console. But here is the important part. Puppy also has access to everything dog has, which includes bark. And since dog already inherited from animal, puppy also has access to eat and the name field. So puppy has four things available: name, eat, bark, and weep. Puppy did not write any of the first three. It simply inherited them through the chain. Now let us look at the main class. Inside the main method, we create an object of type puppy and store it in a variable called p. Then we call p.eat. Puppy does not have an eat method defined inside it. So Java walks up the chain. It checks dog. Dog does not have eat either. So Java walks up one more level to animal. Animal has eat. Java executes it and prints eating to the console. Then we call p.bark. Puppy does not have bark. Java checks dog. Dog has bark. Java executes it and prints barking to the console. Then we call p.weep. Puppy has weep defined inside itself. Java executes it directly and prints weeping to the console. The output we get is eating, then barking, then weeping, each on a new line. This example perfectly demonstrates how multilevel inheritance works. A single object of the lowest class in the chain can access methods from every class above it, all the way up to the top. The code stays clean, there is no repetition, and each class only defines what is new and unique to it. The super keyword is your direct line of communication from a child class up to its parent class. Whenever you are inside a child class and you need to reach up to the parent, whether to call its constructor, call one of its methods, or access one of its fields, super is how you do it. The first and most common use of super is calling the parent class constructor. When a child object is created, the parent part of that object must also be properly set up. You use super with parentheses and the required values to trigger the parent constructor from inside the child constructor. If you do not call super explicitly, Java automatically inserts a hidden call to the parent's no-argument constructor as the first line of your child constructor. But if the parent has only a parameterized constructor with no default, Java cannot insert that call automatically and you get a compile error. This is why knowing super is critical. The second use is calling a parent method when the child has overridden it. If dog has rewritten the sound method but you still want to run animal's original version of sound from inside dog, you write super.sound inside the dog class. This says run the parent version, not mine. The third use is accessing a parent field when both parent and child have a field with the same name. Writing super.name gives you the parent's version of name, while just name gives you the child's own version. The most important rule, super used to call a constructor must be the very first statement inside the constructor. No code can come before it. Java enforces this because the parent must be completely built before the child can build on top of it. The super keyword is your direct line of communication from a child class up to its parent class. Whenever you are inside a child class and you need to reach up to the parent, whether to call its constructor, call one of its methods, or access one of its fields, super is how you do it. The first and most common use of super is calling the parent class constructor. When a child object is created, the parent part of that object must also be properly set up. You use super with parentheses and the required values to trigger the parent constructor from inside the child constructor. If you do not call super explicitly, Java automatically inserts a hidden call to the parent's no-argument constructor as the first line of your child constructor. But if the parent has only a parameterized constructor with no default, Java cannot insert that call automatically and you get a compile error. This is why knowing super is critical. The second use is calling a parent method when the child has overridden it. If dog has rewritten the sound method but you still want to run animal's original version of sound from inside dog, you write super.sound inside the dog class. This says run the parent version, not mine. The third use is accessing a parent field when both parent and child have a field with the same name. Writing super.name gives you the parent's version of name, while just name gives you the child's own version. The most important rule, super used to call a constructor must be the very first statement inside the constructor. No code can come before it. Java enforces this because the parent must be completely built before the child can build on top of it. Imagine your parent taught you a recipe for making tea. You learned it from them. But over time you developed your own better version of the same recipe. Now when someone asks you to make tea, you use your version, not your parents' original. This is exactly what method overriding does in Java. When a child class provides its own implementation of a method that already exists in the parent class, it is called overriding. 3 rules must be followed strictly. The method name must be identical. The parameters must be identical, same types, same order, same count. And the return type must be the same or a compatible type. If any of these conditions are not met, it is no longer overriding. The override annotation is not mandatory, but it is strongly recommended. When you write it, you are asking the compiler to please verify that the method below is actually overriding a real parent method. If you made a typo in the name or got the parameters wrong, the compiler catches it immediately and shows an error. Without the annotation, the compiler stays silent and your broken override becomes a brand new unrelated method, a silent bug that is very hard to find. There are a few restrictions you must know. You cannot override a method marked as final in the parent. You cannot override a static method, as static methods are hidden, not overridden. And the overriding method cannot have a more restrictive access modifier than the parent method. If the parent method is public, the child method cannot be protected or private. Let us walk through this code step by step. We have 3 classes in this example. Animal is the parent class sitting at the top. Dog and cat are both child classes that extend animal. All 3 have a method called sound, but each one behaves differently. That difference is exactly what method overriding is about. Let us start with the animal class. It has a method called sound. This is the original version. When this method runs, it prints some sound to the console. This is the default behavior that animal defines. Now let us look at the dog class. Dog extends animal, which means dog inherits everything from animal including the sound method. But dog does not want to use animal's version. Dog provides its own implementation of sound that prints woof. The override annotation written above the method is telling the compiler to double-check that this method is genuinely overriding a method from the parent class. If the method name had a typo or the parameters were wrong, the compiler would immediately throw an error. This annotation acts as a safety net and it is always a good practice to include it. Now the cat class. Cat also extends animal and also overrides the sound method. Cat's version prints meow. Same method name, same return type, same parameters, but completely different behavior from both animal and dog. Now let us look at what happens inside the main class. First we create an animal object called A and call sound on it. Since A is an animal object, Java runs animal's version of sound and prints some sound. Next we create a dog object called D and call sound on it. Even though dog inherited sound from animal, dog has overridden it. So Java runs dog's version and prints woof. Animal's original version is completely ignored for dog objects. Then we create a cat object called C and call sound on it. Cat has also overridden sound. So Java runs cat's version and prints meow. The final output is some sound, then woof, then meow, each printed on a new line. What makes this powerful is that all 3 classes share the exact same method name, sound. But depending on which object you are calling it on, the behavior changes completely. Each class defines its own version and Java always runs the correct one based on the actual object. This is the foundation of polymorphism, which we are going to explore in detail very soon. The word polymorphism comes from Greek. Poly means many and morph means form. So polymorphism literally means the ability to take many forms. In Java, this concept appears in two very different ways, and understanding both clearly is essential. Compile-time polymorphism, also called static polymorphism, is achieved through method overloading. This means you write multiple methods inside the same class that all share the same name but have different parameters, either a different number of parameters or different types. Java figures out which version to call based on the arguments you pass at the moment of the call, and this decision happens at compile time before the program ever runs. The compiler looks at your call, checks the argument types, matches it to the correct version, and locks in that decision. This is why it is called compile time. Everything is resolved before execution begins. You cannot overload by just changing the return type alone. If two methods have the same name and same parameters but different return types, Java gives you a compile error. The parameter list must differ. Runtime polymorphism, also called dynamic polymorphism, is achieved through method overriding. Here the decision about which version of a method to run is not made at compile time. It is made while the program is actually running, at runtime. This happens because Java allows a parent class reference to hold a child class object. When you call a method through that reference, Java checks at runtime what the actual object type is and runs the correct version. We will see this in action very clearly in the next topic, dynamic method dispatch. Let us walk through this code step by step. We have two classes here, calculator and main. The calculator class is where all the action is, and it demonstrates method overloading very clearly. Inside the calculator class we have three methods and all three of them are named add. Normally having three methods with the same name would cause an error, but in Java this is completely valid as long as the parameters are different. And that is exactly the case here. The first add method takes two parameters of type int and returns their sum as an int. This is for simple whole number addition. The second add method takes two parameters of type double and returns their sum as a double. This handles decimal number addition. Even though the method name is identical to the first one, Java treats them as completely separate because the parameter types are different. The third add method takes three parameters of type int and returns their total as an int. This handles the case where you need to add three whole numbers together instead of two. Now let us look at the main class. We create a calculator object called calc and then call the add method three times. The first call passes two integers, 2 and 3. The compiler looks at these arguments, sees two int values, and matches this call to the first version of add. The result is 5. The second call passes two decimal values, 2.5 and 3.5. The compiler sees two double values and matches this call to the second version of add. The result is 6.0. Notice the output shows 6.0 and not just 6 because the return type is double. The third call passes three integers, 1, 2, and 3. The compiler sees three int values and matches this call to the third version of add. The result is 6. The final output is 5, then 6.0, then 6, each on a new line. What is important to understand here is that the compiler makes all of these decisions before the program ever runs. It looks at the arguments in each call, finds the matching version of add, and locks in that decision at compile time. This is exactly what compile time polymorphism through method overloading means. Dynamic method dispatch sounds like a complex term, but the idea behind it is very elegant. Let us build it step by step. You already know that dog extends animal. So a dog object is an animal, it has everything an animal has, plus its own extras. Because of this relationship, Java allows you to write animal a equals new dog. The reference variable a is of type animal, but the actual object sitting in heap memory is a dog. This is completely valid in Java. Now here is the key question. When you call a dot sound, which version of sound runs? Animal's version or dog's version? The reference type is animal. But the actual object is dog, and dog has overridden sound. Java answers this at runtime by checking what the actual object is, not what the reference type says. At compile time, the compiler only checks whether animal has a method called sound. It does, so the compile is approved. But at runtime, the JVM looks at the actual object type, which is a dog. Dog has its own sound, so Java runs dog's version. This runtime decision is dynamic method dispatch. The word dynamic means it happens live during execution. The word dispatch means deciding which method gets called. This is incredibly powerful because you can write code that works with a parent type reference, and the correct behavior gets dispatched automatically based on whatever actual object you put into that reference, without changing a single line of calling code. This is the foundation of writing flexible and extensible Java programs. Let us walk through this code step by step. We have three classes. Animal is the parent, and dog and cat are both child classes that extend animal. Dog overrides the sound method and prints woof. Cat overrides the sound method and prints meow. Animal's original sound method prints some sound. Now let us look at the main class. This is where dynamic method dispatch actually happens. We create three reference variables, but all three are declared as type animal. This is the key part. Even though two of them are holding child class objects, their reference type is animal. Or one is an animal reference holding an actual animal object. When we call sound on a 1, Java checks the actual object, which is an animal, and runs animal's version. The output is some sound. A 2 is an animal reference but it is holding an actual dog object. At compile time, Java only checks whether animal has a method called sound. It does, so the compile passes. But at runtime, the JVM looks at the actual object sitting in memory, which is a dog. Dog has its own overridden version of sound. So Java runs dog's version and prints woof. A 3 is an animal reference holding an actual cat object. The same process happens. At compile time, Java approves the call because animal has sound. At runtime, the JVM sees the actual object is a cat. Cat has its own overridden version of sound. So Java runs cat's version and prints meow. The final output is some sound, then woof, then meow, each on a new line. Now here is what makes this so powerful. All three calls look completely identical from the outside. All three say animal reference dot sound. But three completely different outputs are produced. The reference type is the same in all three cases, but the actual object type is different, and that is what determines which version of sound runs at runtime. This is exactly what dynamic method dispatch means. There is one important restriction to remember. Through an animal reference, you cannot call methods that are specific to dog or cat, such as bark. The reference type controls what methods you are allowed to call. But for methods that have been overridden, the actual object always decides which version runs. Think about driving a car. When you press the accelerator pedal, the car moves forward. You do not need to know anything about how the fuel injection system works, how the engine converts fuel to motion, or how the transmission adjusts the gear ratio. All of that complexity is hidden from you. You only see and interact with the simple interface, the pedal. This is abstraction in everyday life. In programming, Abstraction works the same way. You expose only what the user of your class needs to know, the method names and what they do, while completely hiding how those methods work internally. The benefit is enormous. If you later change the internal engine of your car, say you switch from petrol to electric, the driver does not need to retrain. The pedal still works the same way from the outside. In the same way, if you change the internal implementation of a method, the callers of that method do not need to change their code at all. Java provides two tools to implement abstraction: abstract classes and interfaces. An abstract class lets you define some methods with implementations and leave others deliberately unimplemented as abstract. An interface takes this further by defining a pure contract with no implementation at all, just method signatures that any implementing class must fulfill. Let us look at both in detail. An abstract class is a class that is intentionally incomplete. It serves as a base template that defines the structure and partially the behavior that all its child classes must follow, but it leaves certain methods deliberately unfinished, marked with the keyword abstract, forcing every child class to complete them. The keyword abstract on a method means that the method is being declared as existing and its name tells you what it should do, but how it does it is left undefined. That responsibility is pushed down to the child class. The child class must override every abstract method and provide an actual body. An abstract class cannot be instantiated. Writing new shape gives you a compile error immediately. This makes perfect sense because shape is an incomplete concept. A shape by itself does not know how to draw itself. Only specific shapes like circle or rectangle know how to draw. So you can only create objects of the concrete child classes, not of the abstract parent. Abstract classes can also have regular non-abstract methods with full bodies. These are inherited normally by all child classes, giving shared behavior that every child gets for free. There is one key rule to remember. If a class extends an abstract class but does not override all the abstract methods, then that class itself must also be declared abstract. Otherwise, the compiler gives an error because you would have an incomplete class that looks like it can be instantiated. Let us walk through this code step by step. We have three classes here. Shape is the abstract parent class, and circle and rectangle are the concrete child classes that extend shape. The shape class is declared abstract. It has a field called color, a constructor that takes color as a parameter and sets it using this .color, one abstract method called draw with no body, and one regular method called display that prints the color to the console. Because draw is abstract, shape is saying that every child class must provide its own version of draw. The circle class extends shape. It has its own field called radius. Its constructor takes two parameters, color and radius. The first line of the constructor calls super with color, which triggers shape's constructor and sets the color field. Then circle sets its own radius field. Circle overrides the draw method and provides its own implementation that prints drawing circle with radius followed by the radius value. The rectangle class also extends shape. It has two fields, width and height. Its constructor takes three parameters, color, width, and height. Just like circle, it calls super with color to let shape handle the color field. Rectangle overrides draw with its own implementation that prints drawing rectangle followed by the width and height values. Now let us look at the main class. We create two shape references. S1 holds a circle object with color red and radius 5.0, and S2 holds a rectangle object with color blue and width 4.0 and height 6.0. Even though both references are of type shape, the actual objects are circle and rectangle. This is dynamic method dispatch in action again. When we call draw on S1, Java checks the actual object at runtime, sees it is a circle, and runs circle's version of draw. The output is drawing circle with radius 5.0. When we call display on S1, Java runs the display method inherited from shape and prints color, red. Circle never had to write this method. It got it for free through inheritance. When we call draw on S2, Java sees the actual object is a rectangle and runs rectangle's version of draw. The output is drawing rectangle 4.0 by 6.0. When we call display on S2, the inherited display method runs and prints color, blue. The final output is drawing circle with radius 5.0, then color, red, then drawing rectangle 4.0 by 6.0, then color, blue, each on a new line. This example brings together abstract classes, constructor chaining with super, method overriding, and dynamic method dispatch all in one place. An interface is a pure contract. Think of it like a legal agreement. The interface says that anyone who signs this agreement must be able to do these specific things. It does not tell you how to do them. It just guarantees that you will. When a class signs that agreement by writing implements followed by the interface name, it is legally bound to provide an actual working body for every method declared in the interface. If it fails to implement even one method, the compiler refuses to compile the class. This is incredibly powerful because you can write code that works with the interface type, and any object that implements that interface can be used regardless of what the object actually is internally. A bird and an airplane are completely different things. But if both implement flyable, you can treat both as flyable objects and call fly on them without knowing their internal details. Interfaces can also contain default methods, which are methods with a full body inside the interface itself marked with the keyword default. These were introduced in Java 8. Default methods allow you to add new methods to an interface without breaking all the existing classes that already implement it. Implementing classes inherit the default method automatically but can also override it if they want their own version. Fields inside an interface are automatically public, static, and final, meaning they are constants. You cannot declare regular instance variables in an interface. A class can implement multiple interfaces, and this is how Java achieves a form of multiple inheritance cleanly and safely, which we will see in the next topic. Let us walk through this code step by step. We have one interface and two classes. Flyable is the interface, and bird and airplane are the classes that implement it. The flyable interface declares two abstract methods, fly and land, with no bodies. Any class that implements flyable must provide its own body for both of these methods. Flyable also has a default method called describe which already has a body written inside the interface itself. This method prints that the object can fly and land. Implementing classes get this method for free and do not have to write it themselves unless they want their own version. The bird class implements flyable. This means bird is legally bound to provide bodies for both fly and land. Bird's version of fly prints bird flaps wings and flies, and bird's version of land prints bird folds wings and lands. Both methods are marked with the override annotation and declared as public. Interface methods are implicitly public, so the implementing class must also declare them as public. The airplane class also implements flyable. Airplane provides its own completely different implementations of fly and land. Airplane's fly prints airplane uses engines to fly, and airplane's land prints airplane uses landing gear. Same method names, completely different behavior from bird. Now let us look at the main class. We declare two variables, f1 and f2, both of type flyable. F1 holds a bird object and F2 holds an airplane object. This is valid because both bird and airplane implement flyable. Just like we saw with abstract classes, we are using the interface type as the reference, and the actual object determines the behavior at runtime. When we call fly on F1, Java sees the actual object is a bird and runs bird's version. The output is bird flaps wings and flies. When we call land on F1, bird's version of land runs and prints bird folds wings and lands. When we call describe on F1, neither bird nor airplane overrode the default method, so Java runs the version inherited directly from the flyable interface and prints that the object can fly and land. When we call fly on F2, Java sees the actual object is an airplane and runs airplane's version. The output is airplane uses engines to fly. When we call land on F2, airplane's version of land runs and prints airplane uses landing gear. When we call describe on F2, the same default method from the interface runs again and prints the same message as before. The key takeaway from this example is that two completely different classes, bird and airplane, share the same interface. You can call the same methods on both using a flyable reference, and each one behaves according to its own implementation. The interface acts as the common contract that connects them, while the actual objects decide the behavior at runtime. You already know Java forbids extending two classes at the same time. The reason is the diamond problem. Imagine two parent classes A and B both have a method called hello with different implementations. Now class C extends both A and B and calls hello. Which version should run? A's or B's? Java cannot decide. This ambiguity is the diamond problem, and it causes real bugs in languages like C++ that allow it. Java's solution is elegant. Interfaces do not have implementation in their abstract methods, just signatures. So if two interfaces both declare a method called fly, and your class implements both, there is no ambiguity. You provide one implementation yourself. Problem solved completely. A class can implement as many interfaces as it needs by separating them with commas after the implements keyword. The class must implement all abstract methods from all the interfaces it signs up for. An interface can also extend other interfaces and even multiple interfaces at once using the extends keyword. This lets you build interface hierarchies and compose complex contracts from simpler ones. This combination of interface-based multiple inheritance gives Java all the flexibility of multiple inheritance with none of the confusion or ambiguity that classes would introduce. Let us walk through this code step by step. We have three interfaces and one class. Flyable, swimmable, and runnable are the three interfaces, and Duck is the class that implements all three of them. Each interface is simple and focused. Flyable declares one abstract method called fly. Swimmable declares one abstract method called swim. Runnable declares one abstract method called run. Each interface represents one specific capability, one contract that a class can choose to sign up for. The Duck class implements all three interfaces by writing implements flyable, swimmable, runnable separated by commas. By doing this, Duck is legally bound to provide bodies for all three methods. Duck provides its own implementation of fly which prints Duck is flying, its own implementation of swim which prints Duck is swimming, and its own implementation of run which prints Duck is running. All three methods are marked with the override annotation and declared as public. Now let us look at the main class. First we create a Duck object called D. Since Duck implements all three interfaces and provided bodies for all three methods, we can call fly, swim, and run directly on D. The output is Duck is flying, then Duck is swimming, then Duck is running. Then we create a flyable reference called f and assign a new duck object to it. Even though the actual object is a duck, the reference type is flyable. This means through f we can only call methods declared in flyable, which is just fly. The compiler will not allow you to call swim or run through a flyable reference. But when fly is called, Java checks the actual object at runtime, sees it as a duck, and runs duck's version of fly. This is dynamic method dispatch working through an interface reference. Then we create a swimmable reference called s and assign a new duck object to it. Through s we can only call swim. Same concept applies. The reference type limits what you can call, but the actual object decides which version runs at runtime. The final output is duck is flying, duck is swimming, duck is running, duck is flying, and duck is swimming, each printed on a new line. What this example shows beautifully is that one class can fulfill multiple contracts at the same time. Duck is simultaneously a flyable, a swimmable, and a runnable. You can pass a duck object anywhere any of these interface types are expected. There is no ambiguity, no confusion, and no diamond problem. This is the clean and powerful way Java achieves multiple inheritance through interfaces. The final keyword in Java is a lock. Wherever you place it, it seals that thing and prevents modification or extension. It works in 3 completely different contexts, and each context has an important purpose. Final on a variable creates a constant. Once you assign a value to a final variable, that assignment is permanent. Any attempt to reassign it gives you a compile error. Final variables are conventionally written in all capital letters with underscores between words, like max_size or pi, to signal to every developer reading the code that this is a constant and should not be touched. A final instance variable must be assigned either at declaration or inside the constructor and never again after that. Final on a method prevents overriding. When you mark a method as final in a parent class, no child class can ever override that method. The child inherits it and can call it, but cannot change its behavior. This is used when a method contains critical logic that must remain consistent regardless of which subclass is using it, for example a security check or a tax calculation that must never be tampered with by anyone extending your class. Final on a class completely seals the class and it cannot be extended by any other class. No inheritance at all. Java's own string class is final. Integer is final. Math is final. This ensures that the behavior of these fundamental classes can never be broken by someone creating a subclass with malicious or incorrect overrides. When you use string, you can guarantee it always behaves exactly as Java defined it. Let us walk through this code step by step. We have 3 classes here: constants, vehicle, and car. Each one demonstrates a different use of the final keyword. Starting with the constants class. The class itself is declared final. This means no other class can extend constants. If anyone tried to write a class that extends constants, the compiler would immediately throw an error. Constants is completely sealed. Inside constants we have 2 fields. Pi is a final instance variable set to 3.14159. Once this value is assigned, it can never be changed anywhere in the program. Any attempt to reassign pi would give a compile error. Max size is declared as both static and final, making it a true global constant. Being static means it belongs to the class itself and not to any object, so you can access it directly using the class name without creating an object. Next we have the vehicle class. Vehicle has a method called startEngine marked as final. This means no child class can ever override startEngine. The logic inside it is locked permanently. Car extends vehicle. Notice that car extends vehicle successfully because vehicle itself is not final, only its method is. Car can add its own new methods freely, and it does so by adding a method called drive. But car cannot override start engine. If car tried to override it, the compiler would refuse and throw an error immediately. Now let us look at the main class. We create a constants object called C and print C.py. Since pi is a final instance variable accessed through an object, it prints 3.14159. Then we print constants.maxSize directly using the class name. Since maxSize is static and final, no object is needed. It prints 100. Then we create a car object called car and call startEngine on it. Even though we are calling it on a car object, car never defined its own version of startEngine. So Java runs vehicles version, which is the only version that will ever exist because final locked it permanently. It prints engine started. Then we call drive on car. Drive is car's own method and it runs normally, printing car is driving. The final output is 3.14159, then 100, then engine started, then car is driving, each on a new line. This example brings all three uses of final together in one place. A final class that cannot be extended, a final variable that cannot be reassigned, and a final method that cannot be overridden. In Java, every single class you ever write, without exception, automatically inherits from a class called object. You do not write extends object yourself, Java adds it silently. This means every object ever created in Java has a common set of methods available inherited from object. These are fundamental tools for working with objects. The toString method is called automatically whenever Java needs to convert your object to a string, for example when you pass it to system.out.println or concatenate it with a string using the plus operator. The default implementation from object returns something like class name at hexadecimal address, which is not very useful. You override toString in your own class to return a meaningful, human-readable description of the object's data. The equals method is used to compare two objects for equality. The default implementation from object compares references, meaning it only returns true if both variables point to the exact same object in memory. But usually you want to compare content. Two dog objects should be considered equal if they have the same name and breed regardless of being different objects in memory. So you override equals to define what equality means for your class. The hashCode method returns an integer code for the object. The contract in Java says that if two objects are equal according to equals, they must return the same hashCode. This is used by collections like HashMap and HashSet to organize objects efficiently. Whenever you override equals, you must also override hashCode to maintain this contract. Breaking it causes bugs in collections that are extremely hard to trace. The getClass method returns the actual runtime class of the object. It cannot be overridden. You use it to inspect what type an object actually is at runtime, for example during debugging or reflection. Let us walk through this code step by step. We have one class called dog and a main class. Dog overrides three methods inherited from the object class, toString, equals, and hashCode. This is a complete and realistic example of how these three methods work together. The dog class has two fields, name of type string and age of type int. The constructor takes both values and assigns them using this .name and this .age. The toString method is overridden to return a clean readable string that shows the dog's name and age in a formatted way. The equals method is overridden to compare two dog objects by their content rather than their memory address. Inside equals, The first check asks whether the current object and the past object are literally the same object in memory. If yes, they are definitely equal and true is returned immediately. The second check asks whether the past object is null or belongs to a different class. If either is true, false is returned. Then the past object is cast to a dog and the name and age fields are compared. If both match, true is returned. The hashcode method is overridden to return a consistent integer based on the name and age fields. This ensures that two dog objects with the same data always produce the same hashcode, which is required by Java's contract. Now let us look at the main class. We create three dog objects. D1 is Bruno aged 3, D2 is also Bruno aged 3, and D3 is Max aged 5. When we call toString on D1 explicitly, it prints dog name Bruno aged 3. When we pass D1 directly to println without calling toString, Java calls toString automatically behind the scenes and produces the exact same output. Both lines print identically. When we compare D1 and D2 using the double equals operator, the result is false. Even though both dogs have the same name and age, they are two completely separate objects sitting at two different memory addresses. The double equals operator compares references, not content. When we call equals on D1 and pass D to, the result is true. Our overridden equals method checks whether they are the same object in memory, which they are not. Then it checks whether they belong to the same class, which they do. Then it compares name and age. Both name and age match, so equals returns true. When we call equals on D1 and pass D3, the result is false. Max and age 5 do not match Bruno and age 3. When we print the hashcode of D1 and D2, both print the same number. This is required by Java's contract. Since D1 and D2 are considered equal by our equals method, their hashcode values must also be equal. Our implementation adds the hashcode of name to the value of age, which produces the same result for both objects since they have identical data. When we call getClass.getName on D1, it returns the actual runtime class name as a string, which is dog. This confirms the real type of the object at runtime. The final output is the formatted dog string printed twice, then false, then true, then false, then the same hashcode number printed twice, and finally dog as the class name. Thank you for watching this video. I hope this explanation helped you clearly understand the advanced OOP and its core components in a structured and easy way. Continue learning, keep practicing, and stay consistent with your preparation. More detailed concepts are coming next.